started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESG-CV. My name is Shavonna Michaela, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. Office hours recordings are on the HCD ESG webpage under Technical Assistance and Training. A copy of the slide deck and recording will be emailed to you by your grant administrator or annual representative. Next slide, please. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question in the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All question and answers entered into the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESG-CV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. Today's office hours session agenda includes the following: announcements, ESG, ESG-CV updates, office hours update, ESG, ESG-CV Q&A, and today's brown bag session on coordinated entry, assessing the assessment. Next slide, please. New ESG, ESG-CV training calendar site. HCD has created a training calendar site that will display all the upcoming trainings that are being held by ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Contract. On the site, you will find the dates, times, and links to register for various trainings. This calendar will be updated on a regular basis as new trainings get announced, so please click this site regularly to see what upcoming training opportunities you are interested in. We have also incorporated a link right here. This link will be dropped in the chat as well as on the slides when emailed. Next slide. And now I will hand it over to Connie for our ESG updates.
Thank you, Shavonna. Good morning, everybody. So to start with, 2022 ESG NOFA applications. Plan to release those at the end of May. So be watching for those. And of course, along with those, after that would be webinar, workshops, and so forth. So we're starting to work on our 2022 NOFA applications. For those that submitted applications under the 2021 ESG annual NOFA, we hope to make award announcements the end of this month or the first part of April. We're working very hard to get through all the internal process for that and get you your award announcements, and those will be posted to the website also. 2020, those who have 2020 annual contracts. You've seen this slide before. I'm going to keep this slide with us for a while. Just a reminder, we're working very hard this year to really review the detailed expense reports. We're doing our mini monitoring where we're asking for some backup documentation, maybe some leases, making sure you're doing the FMR, the fair market rent, and the rent reasonableness and so forth. Please be detailed on your detailed expense reports. We're seeing a lot of charges just lumped together and with very vague descriptions. So please, if you're charging wages, be sure you give us the title. We don't need the name per se of the employee, but the title is very important. If you're not sure what we're looking for, we would be very happy to meet with you on a Teams call, and we can walk through a detailed expense report together, answer any questions, and it's also just nice to get together and get to know everybody. Next slide, please. Again, those with 2020 contracts, July 7th, it's going to be right around the corner for us. That is your expenditure deadline. Be sure that you got that in mind. Be sure you're working as hard as you can to expend your 2020 contracts. If you're struggling, now is the time to reach out to your rep. Please do not wait until June. And we'll see if we can talk about, maybe there's a budget revision we can help you with. Let's do some brainstorming and see if there's anything we can help you with, but reach out to us. Next slide, please. And again, I like to have this slide just to remind you, we have a great ESG annual team. They're hard workers, and they really want to provide you with good customer service and help you with your grants. Please reach out to us at any time through the ESG NOFA inbox, and we will respond. We're in there several times throughout the day, and we do respond quickly. That is all I have today on the ESG annual front, so I'm going to turn it back over to Shavana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Connie. Now I have just a few ESG CV updates and reminders. Continue to work towards submitting your February RFF and budget amendments for cleaning up indirect costs in e-civis. If you have been instructed to submit a spending plan for March, do so by the deadline provided by your ESG CV grant administrator. Next slide, please. HCD office hours updates. The following topics are coming up. On 316, Coordinated Entry System, FAQ. On 323, Racial Equity and Data, HMIS and HDIS. On 330, Engagement and DB Providers, CES, COC Board. And on 4.6, Equal Access Rule, EAR Tool, Planning for LGBTQ plus Inclusion. Next slide, please. COVID response resources. The links that you see on the screen will be emailed out in the presentation. Next slide, please. ESG resource links. Again, the links that you see will be provided on the slides that are emailed out. At this time, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat, and you may also continue to do that throughout the presentation. Okay, if there are no questions at this time, next slide, please. How to contact us. If you have any further questions, please contact us. Annual ESG, please reach out to ESG representative or esg@hcd.ca.gov. ESG CV, please reach out to your grant administrator. Next slide, please. And now I will hand it over to Chris Pitcher for today's brown bag presentation on coordinated entry, assessing the assessment.
Thank you, Shavana, and thank you all for being here. We do have a couple of procedural questions for our team to answer in the chat, so I'll just leave that there. This is the part of the office hours where we kind of switch a little bit. This is called the brown bag. Welcome to the brown bag today. We are going to hit on a very hot topic. This is not a hot California topic. This is a hot topic everywhere. How do we, through a coordinated entry process, really assess our assessment process, one of our big 4 components of coordinated entry. This is definitely a hot topic. I think there's 2 things that are driving it, in my opinion, but I'll leave it to my guests, Abby Miller and Mindy Mitchell, to go into deeper. But a lot of us during COVID took our assessment tool and tossed it aside for a bit and used tools developed either by the CDC or locally to kind of prioritize folks that were most at risk of catching or mostly perishing from COVID-19. That was something that we did nationally in many communities very quickly. We switched to that and we're able to go. I think the other thing that's driving this is the major tool that most COCs use is no longer really being supported. And we're left to say, well, what do we do? What tool do we use? How do we get there? And we're going to try to talk about that today. There is no easy answer. I'm going to start there. So not to set up expectations, there is no easy answer. There's not an off-the-shelf thing that you can take that's great. I think the other piece of this that is really driving this conversation is also thinking about how we embed racial equity into our process. And how do we do that without, one, breaking fair housing, and or two, really not being thoughtful on how we engage our local community. So with those set up, I'm going to leave it to our next set of guests. But remember, as a brown bag, you're able to unmute yourself to ask questions. You can raise your hand, we'll unmute you, or you can put it in the chat. This is meant to be a discussion. We only have about, I think, 7 slides to cover, and then it's just talking about what you're doing perhaps in your community to address this emergent need, kind of at a very vital turning point for what our coordinated entry process is in its development nationally. So with that, I'm going to hand it to my very first presenter today, Abby Miller. Abby, go ahead and take us away.
All right, thanks, Chris. Hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so happy to be here talking about this topic. Before going to the next slide, I just want to do a brief introduction, mainly so that you know that you can mine my brain as well as Mindy's during this brown bag session. So I had been at HUD for most of the last decade, and actually had the opportunity to be a primary author on the coordinated entry notice, and do the policy thinking behind that. So if you have thorny questions that have been bothering you for like 4 or 5 years now, you can ask those today. And if you just want to silently swear at me, that's fine too. I understand. But hopefully we can get through some of the unintended consequences of the notice and get to where we want to be. So if you can go to the next slide, get started. Okay, so I'm going to keep this part very short, mainly because I think everybody knows what coordinated entry is. What I would like to say about coordinated entry that perhaps isn't written in the wording of the notice, but that I think we were holding in mind when we were writing policy for coordinated entry, and I know that HUD and various actors continue to think about it this way. Coordinated entry is an approach to move the decisions about individual folks' success or barriers in the system, to take that to a system level, so that folks are not getting left behind, particularly the folks that have the highest barriers to housing. We are going to go into this today, I think, hopefully quite deep, but this idea of barriers to housing has been variously called vulnerabilities, severity of need. But I think with that, we also lost this idea that there are other barriers to housing. And this obviously ties into the racial equity work that needs to happen now. Think that coordinated entry was always envisioned as an ordering principle for a system. It was part of HUD's push towards system level thinking from the creation of and requirements around continuums of care a number of years ago, to the implementation of the system performance measures, changing the AHAR data collection from fill-ins to actually like looking at something at the system level. And coordinated entry was part of that same thing. This is meant to think as a system, not just PSH, not just the folks that are associated with that higher intensity intervention, but everybody. So that's the basis of all of this. And I think the more we can stay grounded in that, in a coordinated entry as an ordering principle for the system, the easier it will be to make the changes that need to be made in coordinated entry processes across the state. Can you go to the next slide? So the bad old days, the trying to get better days. The bad old days were when every project in a community was making their own decisions, setting up their own criteria for who they will bring in, who they will not. And I think we can all understand pretty easily why that was not working. You cannot plan to end homelessness on a project level. There's simply not the vantage that you need to see all of the moving pieces, to see who's becoming homeless, who's staying homeless longer. That has to happen at a system level. And also, there were a lot of project practices, entry practices, where they would say, well, we don't think we can serve this person. Their needs are too high, or their barriers are too high. We're not well equipped. We're gonna go with these folks that we know can be successful. Understandable, but the problem there is that the folks with the higher barriers, the folks with the higher severity of needs, need help, and they need help more than others, because the barriers are already stacked so high. And so we had a situation where projects were serving folks who were literally homeless, but we're going to have a much easier exit path out of homelessness. And we were passing over systematically folks that were going to be harder to serve, for a variety of reasons. Like I said, severity of needs, vulnerabilities, other housing barriers. So we're doing all of this work to try to act and think as a system, make the decisions that need to be made at the system level, which is very complicated, and I think has led to some of the adoption of tools and rules that say, if we do this and if we just keep doing this, then things are going to work out the way they're supposed to. And I think we're all sitting in a place now of understanding that no, there are not a set 1, 2, 3, 4 rules to follow. And so we're figuring it out. And with that, I will turn it to Mindy Mitchell to talk more about the assessment itself. Oh no, Mindy, did we lose you? Ah, there you go.
I'm here.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. Can we go ahead and start the next slide? Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, the reason why I put this up, this is actually, there's a link here for the HUD mini page document that talks about the coordinated entry core elements. What I wanted to highlight here today, we're mostly going to be talking about assessment tools, and there's a reason for that. But the important thing to think about is, like Abby talked about, coordinated entry is meant to be a collective impact kind of model of bringing the whole community together, working together as a system. So there's more than just that assessment piece to it. But even this conceptualization of the core elements might think about might in there. Also, like Abby mentioned, and this is totally understandable, it's just, man, this is hard work. It's hard work from a provider level. It's hard work level, it's hard work at the state level. To the extent that we can try to find something and just say, like, do it this way, that makes our jobs and our lives easier, right? But we also have to maintain that ability to be flexible, and think about where things don't make as much sense, where they might be having a different kind of impact, while still maintaining kind of that structure and always bringing it back to that foundational reason for doing coordinated entry, which is that we want to move from kind of a provider-centric approach to a community level and person-centered approach to homelessness, so we can actually end homelessness and solve that problem. So this, again, is just up there, like, this is the larger context of coordinated entry, but might is important in here for thinking about those flexibilities. Next slide. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so what I wanted to say in the context of assessment tools, and I think this is just kind of there is always a disconnect and a level of misunderstanding, possible misinformation, some myth making, some myth busting that's necessary about what happens at a policy level, especially federal policy, and how things work out at the local level. One of the common misconceptions about assessment tools was that HUD requires this tool, whatever that tool is. For many communities, it was understood that that must be the VI SPDAT. From the beginning, no particular tool, no specific tool was ever required by HUD. A lot of communities were really surprised to hear that. It was just that you have to have some tool, some mechanism for ensuring that you're coming up with some kind of community-wide way to be more fair and assess people and prioritize people based on their level of vulnerability for the scarce housing resources that we all had at the time. Another thing to say about assessment tools, that most common tool, the VI SPDAT, was never intended to be a housing assignment tool. So again, the difference in kind of policy and practice and just trying to get stuff done on the ground in the everyday, like emergency level life of what we're all living through when we're trying to help folks in their homelessness, is that we took what was supposed to be a case management tool, right, for assessing someone's, literally in some cases, someone's vulnerability to dying, and tried to turn that into, if someone scores this on this tool, then they therefore must go into this type of housing. That is not how that tool was ever intended to be used, but it's what ended up happening in a lot of communities. So these are all things to think about as we're reassessing how we're assessing folks. Another thing that I'll talk a little bit more about in the next slide is that while in some communities, some assessments of that assessment tool found that there was a racially disparate outcome from that tool, in other communities, there was actually no difference by race based on assessment. And in some communities, they found that the outcomes from the VI SPDAT were actually biased in favor of Black folks experiencing homelessness. All of which just goes to say, the tools are the tools, right? What really matters is being very thoughtful about how we're using them. And I'll talk more about that in the next slide. Another thing to think about, and this is what I really hope today's conversation can be focused on, is thinking about what are we assessing for? And how do we use that assessment for equitably prioritizing resources? That's a really rich and robust conversation that a lot of communities are starting to have now that there is this movement away from any particular assessment tool that we've all been using, or the urge to try to find, hey, what's the assessment tool to use? You really should be having a conversation at your community level and asking, like, what does the decision-making structure look like? Who has the power in our community to decide who gets what resources? What are our goals on ending homelessness, but also racial equity, and how those two things work together? Making sure that when we're thinking about this, it's never going to be just a one-time thing. We're always doing it this way. We want to help be always flexible within the boundaries of honoring the reason why of coordinated entry and assessment, and that is to get the folks who most need the housing into that housing. And by the way, this is using assessment tools themselves and doing coordinated entry itself is a matter of racial equity. The bad old days that we talked about before, not because anybody was purposefully trying to have a disparate impact on particularly Black and Indigenous peoples experiencing homelessness, but when it was provider-centric, when there were really high barriers to getting entry, that had a negative impact on people of color experiencing homelessness. We want to make sure as we build out our coordinated entry systems and the role of the assessment tool that we don't perpetuate that racial disparity in the new system that we're building. Next slide. Okay, so I won't spend a ton of time on this flow chart, but I could spend all day talking about this flow chart because those of you who know me know that I love flow charts. Also, to give you a little background on this, there's a link to this flow chart, including a more extensive presentation about the flow chart. The history of this thing is when Cynthia Najendra, who's now with the city of San Francisco, and I both worked at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, you know, the conversation was just beginning about assessment tools and their impact, their racial impact particularly. And as we were talking about it, it was like, it's much more complex than just about the tool itself, right? When you're thinking about coordinated entry, this conversation about the assessment tool should be happening through a bigger lens about coordinated entry and equity. So what you'll see here on this flow chart is the conversation about equity and coordinated entry starts way back at the beginning of who is experiencing homelessness, how are they touching the system in the first place, right? So what you'll see here is that this starts with, like, if I'm building my coordinated entry system where somebody is making contact with the homelessness system, who feels comfortable accessing the homelessness system in the way that you've set it up? Who has access to phones? We think most folks do, but maybe folks don't, right? If you're doing outreach, what outreach, where are you doing outreach, in what communities? We already know from point in time counts, and we know from just evaluations of different outreach programs that we often miss places in our community where people of color experiencing homelessness are, and that affects who's even coming into the system, right? So as you'll see here in this flow chart, again, I won't go through the whole thing, but if any of you, like Abby said before, we are available for any of you to just reach out, talk to me about this. I love talking through this whole flow chart thing with folks. And this is part of the kind of brainstorming process about the whole thing that you should be doing in your communities. But what I want you to notice here for this particular conversation is that there's just one little piece of it that's assessment tools, right? There are considerations about the assessment tool, which I talked about earlier, which is because we know that we've seen with VI SPDAT, right? It had different outcomes by race in different communities. Some of them showed that there were different outcomes that were biased towards white people experiencing homelessness. Some had no disparity in outcomes. Some had a bias towards Black people experiencing homelessness, all of which implicates that it's how you're doing the assessment tool, what you're asking, who's doing the asking, right? Like all of those considerations, whatever tool you're using, are things that you need to think about with the tool that you develop too. Next slide. Okay. I think now we're going to have a great conversation, and I am looking forward to it.
Yes, thank you, Mindy, and thank you, Abby, for that. Obviously, I'm hearing a lot about this across California, hearing a lot about this across all the country that I work in, of having an assessment tool that is not only racially equitable, but works within our system and actually prioritizes folks for housing. And I think you laid out the problem very well. And also that the solution is not an easy one size fits all, take something off the shelf. It was never that, but that's what it became, the way that we operationalize coordinated entry. And I can say it, I openly here, I don't think Abby will get too upset, but having coordinated entry be a thing before the coordinated entry notice was out, or a lot of guidance was out, left space for many of us to just take whatever we could as guidance and follow it. And that might not have been the best thing, but that is the reality of our situation. So it is now time for discussion. If coordinated entry is something that you're interested in, and assessing your assessment is something you're interested in, please put it in the chat, raise your hand or unmute yourself and talk to us. One of the things that is interesting to me is we're talking about assessing the assessment, but this is really just one piece of the bigger coordinated entry picture, which is on a regular basis and at least annually, we should be assessing our coordinated entry system as a whole. The assessment is one of the hot topics now, but how we prioritize is also something that we need to think about on a regular basis. It might not even need to wait for annually to think about how we prioritize, because that is so very important to our systems. And as I said, many of us went to a COVID-19 specific prioritization for a bit and came back and now we're looking potentially to do it differently, maybe through a racial equity lens or some other lens. Carrie, I'm going to call on you because you were brave enough to put something in the chat. Would you mind talking about what is happening in Marin County? And
sure.
To work on that. Thank you, Carrie. Appreciate you.
Yeah, so Marin has, like I think most folks has had a lot of people who were really dissatisfied with the VI SPDAT for some time. And with the sort, and our sort of approach has always been like, guys, we got to use something. Like nobody has a better one. Like right now, like we totally, like if there are ways we can sort of, we look at what we're prioritizing people on, a lot of our focus, we actually did a racial equity analysis of how our prioritization was working, and chose, what VI SPDAT factors we prioritize specifically to try and get a, to be prioritizing people in line with their representation in our homeless population. And so that, that worked okay. But still, like, just people being like, look, there are so many vulnerabilities that we see that just are not reflected. So, we said like, okay, you know what, like, it's time. It is time. The tide is shifting away from the VI SPDAT. We don't want to wait 3 years for somebody else to figure out a good thing that we can just swipe. So like, let's start, let's see what we can do. So we looked at a variety of different assessments. So we convened a group basically like saying like, look, this is an open group, public group. Anybody who is interested in, how we prioritize people is welcome to come to this. We want to do this with an equity lens. And we got, I think, a really great sort of cross section. We have policy people, we have program managers, we have frontline staff, we have, case managers who do permanent supportive housing. We've got shelter workers. So like very outreach. We've got at the moment, only one lived experience person, but so we have one lived experience person. So, we did have this good cross section. And basically, yeah, we looked at these sort of existing assessments to see like, okay, which of these do we like best? Like, we're not going to just necessarily like, what is a good starting point? Because we didn't want to start from scratch because that seemed way too much. But, if we could get a good starting point and maybe rephrase some questions, add some questions, remove some questions, whatever. So the one that we decided we liked the most is the LifeWorks self-sufficiency matrix, which is people like that it's really strengths-based. And so we started with that. We talked to the folks at LifeWorks. We tried there. I think there were a couple communities that had used it for coordinated entry at one point, and we sort of tried to contact them and get some information about that. I think San Luis Obispo did, and they switched to the VI SPDAT. And so we were like, well, we want to find out why. Like, if they were like, yeah, we found out that it worked terribly for coordinated entry, that would have been good to know. But we weren't really able to connect in too much detail with folks. So we started with that. We've now spent probably about 4 months of bi-weekly meetings, bi-weekly every other week, not bi-weekly twice a week, but every other meeting every other week, and just going through, what questions what's not covered, can we create some new questions to cover that?
Is this Martha? How may I help
Phrasing
you?
of some questions. And we are so our next meeting is right after this one. With any luck, we will be finishing at that meeting. And so then the next step is going to be getting it translated to Spanish and then doing a test run. So we're starting with the family assessment for a couple of reasons. One is that we have a lot fewer families. So if we have to reassess everyone, reassessing, 60 to 90 families is going to be easier than, reassessing, 900 single adults. So we're gonna do some testing with the assessment, see how it works. And with the testing, we're going to be looking at two things. One is just, do we need to tweak any other questions? But also just what kind of results are we getting, and how does that, how do they sort of correspond with the people, are we seeing like, hey, the question we have on homelessness, like everyone who's homeless gets, the lowest score. So is this question meaningless? Like, should we break this up into different, different layers of homelessness, different layers of vulnerability? but then also like, okay, if we don't want to break it up into different layers of vulnerability, should we not really look at that question for scoring? Like, so what should we be using for? So we're not looking at even thinking about scoring yet. We're going to do the test before we talk about scoring, and then sort of come up with, are we looking at specific questions? Are we looking at overall score? Is it some combination of those? And so then once we do that, then we'll be moving on to single adults. Oh, and the other reason we started with families was that's also sort of an equity thing. Like, I think family systems in general tend to be like, hey, let's create an adult system, and then what do we have to tweak to make it work for families with children? And if you look at our, adult homeless population, it's about, 50% non-Hispanic white. And if you look at our family population, it's about 20% non-Hispanic white. So like our family population is a lot, has a lot more people of color in it. So really wanting to sort of center, make that the center population that we're looking at, and then sort of looking at single adults later. That's where
Thank you, Carrie, for being a guest presenter today. I didn't realize we were going to be able to get that much out of you, but I have a follow-up question before I hand it to Abby and Mindy to react. My follow-up question is, I've heard a lot of communities really struggle with pulling off what you did, and they don't have the time or the capacity or ability at this moment. How did you deal with that? Did you use some COC planning grant funds? Did you use some state funds? Did you just set aside? How did you get the movement going? Because I think that's where a lot of folks are, is like, we'd like to do this, but we're not sure how to move it forward.
I mean, I think the fact that we're willing to sort of do it, like, it wasn't like, hey, we're going to take a month and really bang this thing out. It was like, look, we're getting, 1 hour every couple weeks out of folks. It's totally volunteer. If you can only make it one of those 2 weeks, that's fine too. But honestly, I think there was such an appetite for it. I think when we said, hey, we want to do this, people were like, oh my gosh, finally, like, we've been waiting for you guys. You guys keep making us use the stupid VI SPDAT. You're finally going to take the time to do it. So, I think for us on the policy side, it was us being like, look, we're totally swamped. We're managing 50 new grants from the state and the feds. We're, doing COVID response on top of our normal policy work, but we have to do this. Like, this is really important. So like, let's make time for it. And then when we did, we were like, guys, we're making time for it. Everybody was like, yes, we will too.
Great, that is very helpful, Carrie. And just to reiterate, the tool that you were looking at was LifeWorks Self-Sufficiency Matrix. So for other folks who want to, I know everyone's asking every time we talk about this, what are other folks using? So there's one we can put into our cache, LifeWorks Self-Sufficiency Matrix. Mindy, it looks like you're off mute. Would you like to react and then pass it to Abby for some reactions too?
Yes. First of all, congrats, Carrie, and for the whole community for just jumping in. It's scary to do. It's hard to do for just capacity reasons, if no other things. It's not like we don't all have a lot of other things going on, especially during the pandemic, right? And so kudos for taking the risk and being vulnerable and opening it up. And I think I linked to LifeWorks here. I actually worked with LifeWorks when I did a lot of youth policy work, and they were just so open to, for those of you who have worked on youth homelessness, like, it's part of our field that was not at the forefront of doing housing first kind of work, right? And LifeWorks was one of those early adapters of housing first approaches, including rapid rehousing for youth. Just so willing, I think, and this is like a good way to approach all of this, so willing to like try new things and focus on ending homelessness, and especially for providers, right? Like, to think about ending homelessness and not just ending homelessness for this young person right in front of me, which is what you should be doing. But again, that's part of that foundational reason about coordinated entry, is like, those things that providers do are great things. It's great for the individual people who get into those programs. It may or may not do anything to actually move the needle on homelessness in our communities. So when we're thinking about things from that perspective, some of the stuff that you talked about, Carrie, is, and what I wanted to ask you about and kind of touch on is, bringing it back to when we're thinking about what vulnerabilities are and what we're assessing for and how we want to prioritize. I always like to think of coordinated entry, the homelessness system, right? The crisis response system, collective impact. It all still exists. We have a lot more flexibility than we think we do, but it does exist inside some bumpers, right? Like I think about bumper cars. And sometimes what we can do is want to be assessing for vulnerabilities and prioritizing and building systems that are about ending someone's poverty and not just ending homelessness. So I think that's some of the tension that's part of those community conversations, which, oh, by the way, is another reason why it's hard to have those conversations. I would love to hear more, Carrie, about any of that kind of, or other folks on the call, like as you're having these conversations in your communities, are you bumping kind of up against that? And then, Carrie, can you tell us a little bit more? I put in some examples that I know other communities are using, and folks on the call, I know some other communities in California have done this, where if we're thinking about racial equity and coordinated entry and assessment and what we're assessing for and what we're trying to get at in that and how we're prioritizing from that assessment, while we know that we don't want to violate fair housing, we don't want to violate the Civil Rights Act, right? So it's not as simple as just target to people of color these housing resources. There's good, again, the bumpers, right? There's good reasons for those things being in place, but we want to be equitable in our outcomes. So some of the things that communities have done is thinking about involvement with other quote unquote feeder systems like child welfare, like the criminal justice system, as risk factors, because we know those are barriers to stability. And by the way, for reasons of historical and structural racism, those systems themselves overly impact communities of color. So in places like Montgomery County, PA, Allegheny County, PA, lots of good stuff happening in PA, and other communities across the country, they've thought about it that way. Robert talked about in the chat too, like, it's always a balancing act, but we want to try to there's a reason we're doing coordinated entry. We want to hold on to the good reason for do that, but not then just producing another system that's fundamentally unfair. So that was a lot of talking, but Carrie, yeah, or anybody else that's doing this, kind of your thoughts on that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are definitely things that we have thought about. So I think, in terms of, so we've been really lucky in that we've had sort of our family shelter staff and family coordinated entry staff participating pretty robustly. And so and family rapid rehousing too, actually. So, they've basically come to us and been like, hey, these are all the places where these are on our domestic violence staff actually too. So like basically, any people who are able to really identify places where things are causing people to fall into homelessness and that are making it difficult for them to get out. So, we do have things that are not, that are more likely to impact certain communities. We have things about like, police involvement in unsafe neighborhoods and, all things like that. I think in terms of systems connection. So, one of the things we've looked at, we've always thought like, if there's some way for us to get, assessments are always going to be a little bit flawed, right? Because you're depending on somebody's self-report, and a lot of the time people's self-reports aren't accurate either, because they're like, no, I'm not gonna tell somebody like, hey, I'm homeless with my kid and also I do a lot of meth. They're gonna take my kid away. So like, yeah. People who aren't willing to share that information, people who are like, I'm not crazy, like I'm the captain of this entire country. Like, it's like, okay, well, that's probably not true. So like, people who don't know the accurate answers, people who aren't willing to share that, so I think we've looked at like, hey, is there a way we can use objective data, can we use hospital records? Can we use, systems involvement? And I think the thing we always ran into with that is a lot of the time, the people who are the most vulnerable are the ones who aren't connecting to their systems. And that's, part of their vulnerability is like, they're really avoiding any of that engagement. So they're not able to get any assistance that comes with it. So, that's one of the things we, with our current VI SPDAT, one of the things we prioritize on is inpatient hospital admissions. But then we've also had to create this sort of like medical decliner form where we can say like, a case manager can say, hey, I'm working with this guy. He doesn't have any hospital admissions, but he should. And like, he doesn't because he's undocumented. He's like, I will not go to the hospital for anything. Or, he's got previous medical trauma and he won't engage with doctors. So like, I can document that like, he's got this really significant health problem. And so like, we have to sort of come up with ways around that sort of thing. So we're leaning away from systems. I mean, we have questions about systems involvement in the assessment, but in terms of using sort of that data, I think it's really tough.
Thank you, Carrie. Abby, do you want to react to that? Then I have a question directed right at you once you're done with your video.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little more about the system use approach or system involvement approach, because I think what Robert said in the chat, that some of the previous attempts like Fuse seem to have failed. I think, Carrie, you're getting at the issues that have caused some of that failure. But back to my earlier point, that we're looking at vulnerability, severity of need, and housing barriers. And those all three have to show up in whatever kind of assessment process you're using. So if you look at Fuse and a lot of other like high utilizer studies that were done, that's focused on high utilizers of the medical system. So what do we know about the medical system? We know that folks of color have trouble accessing. We know that particularly Black folks have lower pain levels recorded. They have lower diagnoses recorded. And so when you're thinking about, what do we have on record for somebody to show the severity of their need or the level of vulnerability, we know that that is also inherently discriminatory. So there's that. There's accounting for within the medical system or within the foster care system, like who's getting access, who's overrepresented here because of state involvement in families' lives, like Child Protective Services. So there's, I think, two buckets of considerations that you need to think through, and you're talking about it, Carrie. Like this is more for, I feel like I'm looking at you, but this is a broad you. You have to think about the access issues. So if I use this system involvement data, am I going to then be overly, am I going to create a disparate outcome because of who's reflected in these records? The other is, do you have all of the system involvement that you need to? So like focusing just on medical high utilizers, well, then you're just going to get people who are medically vulnerable. And what we've seen, at least in PSH, is it tends to skew white and male for folks with really high medical vulnerabilities. And if you just, putting that bluntly, like how much worse off does a white person have to be to reach that point? Because there aren't the other racism-driven barriers in place. So it's like making sure that you have all of those and not just putting all your eggs in one basket, like, oh, we like connected with United Healthcare and we're going to get their records. And if you just do that, you'll end up in the same place you started. Okay.
Abby, my question to you is kind of the question I asked to Carrie, but slightly different. So I've also heard from a lot of communities, it is hard to get this conversation started of migrating away from the VI SPDAT because most of our HMIS implementations have baked that in. And in order for us to leave it, we have to build something else. And either that's a cost or it's a big energy expense for us to develop those. So I just wonder if you had any reaction to that, because I have heard that as kind of a barrier to this conversation moving forward. And as my previous HMIS expert from HUD, I wanted to ask you that specific question, but Mindy, feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah, I think it is unfortunate that vendors that sell nationally coded a particular tool into their software, because good luck like getting a group of people who are overworked to make any decision other than using that tool. So I think that's a short-sightedness of our system. I think most COCs struggle to fund HMIS at a level that you would need to actually have all of the functionality that you want and that is actually tailored to your community, and does the other stuff that it has to do. So that's an ongoing issue. I think though, like if we're talking about using more objective data that we have, one of the ways that we do have that is truly objective is how many times has this household been homeless in our system, or in whatever system you can reach in your HMIS, if you have a statewide, how many times have folks been homeless? Because the number one factor in predicting future episodes of homelessness is, have you already been homeless once? There is a threshold factor there that if you simply rely on that and know that if somebody's coming back in, that they are so much more vulnerable than the folks coming in as newly homeless, provided that they haven't also been homeless somewhere else. So there are limitations to that data, but that particular factor is really big. The other is, how long is the current episode? There's limited research that says number of episodes may matter, but not enough for me to feel totally comfortable saying that. I think that the things are, have they been homeless ever before? And how long is their current episode going on? Because the longer somebody remains homeless, the more help they need to end the episode, because that's proof, day 1, 2, 3, 4, that there's not a solution, that person or that household is identified.
Yeah.
And that you can get from your HMIS, from any HMIS. But that requires, building a report, using a predetermined report, and you can use that information to structure your BINAM list then.
Thank you for talking a little bit of HMIS with me, Abby. It always is a pleasure.
Of course.
Mindy, you mentioned in your work with Cynthia that you kind of tested the VI SPAT or looked at it and found it to be racially equitable in some places and racially inequitable in other places. And I think there were some comments in the chat somewhere, I've lost them now, from our friends in Humboldt County that were kind of echoing that it's more maybe about implementation than it is about the tool itself. So I wonder if you want to riff on that a little bit more.
Yeah. It's not just about the VI SPAT. I mean, there's literature on just general assessment tools, evaluation tools, interviewing, like all of that kind of stuff. There's plenty of literature on just like who's doing the interviewing matters. Potentially about racial similarity across interviewer and interviewee, class similarity, gender, all of that kind of stuff, right? The skill level of who is doing the interviewing, where you're doing outreach to do interviews. There's just, again, the complexity is so much there that you have to think about that. You definitely want to think about the tool itself and analyze what in the tool could be problematic, but also think about who's administering the tool, how it's being administered, where it's being administered, where people have to come to do the tool, how long is the damn tool, right? Like what language is the tool in? There's just so much more than just out of hand saying, this tool is awful, don't use it, right? Which is why we wanted to pull together that bigger thinking about things. Another example of this kind of thinking about things is part of that flow chart is on housing outcomes. So we know in a lot of the work that was done early on looking at communities and racial equity and outcomes, there were quite a few communities. So if you think about the inflow and the outflow part, right? Like we know there's disparities on inflow, and that is largely to do with the disparities in poverty, right? It's a huge function of disparity in poverty, the disparity in the feeder systems and all of these other systems that touch communities of color in a disparate way. And then there's disparities within the homelessness system, right? And that's something the homelessness system can do something about. And then there's potentially disparities out of the homelessness system where we would consistently see, even if there weren't, when communities did an assessment of who was getting into programs, who was getting into different types of programs, a lot of communities surprisingly didn't have disparities there, like the reflection of folks getting into shelter, getting into permanent housing. Some places PSH, it was a bigger one for the vulnerability, the medical vulnerability that Abby talked about, rapid rehousing, but where there were consistently racial disparities was in returns to homelessness. So being more thoughtful and thinking about the complexities of what might be going on there, there's a range of possibilities, and it's probably not just one thing, it's probably a combination of things, but each of those things implies changes that you want to make in your system. So think about, I look at my data, right? The data that we do all have, the very simple data that we do all have. And I see that I have a disproportionality in Black people returning to homelessness after rapid rehousing. What might be going on there? There's a lot of things that could be going on there, and you can delve deeper into your data and see individual program level outcomes. First of all, you might have one rapid rehousing program that doesn't have disparate outcomes and doesn't have disparate returns to homelessness. You may have a particular program that has a hugely skewed outcome. That says some things. I need to be looking at this particular program. There may be every rapid rehousing program is showing the same disparate outcome, and that involves another thing. But just let's say I look at my community, I see disparate outcomes and rapid rehousing data by race. What might be going on there? It might be that I have a just overtly racist case manager that is just doing a really bad job by her clients of color, right? It might be that she just needs some cultural competency training. It might be that she needs to not have that job anymore. It might be that we're not connecting Black folks to the services that they need, to the places where they have community connections, to culturally competent services and resources that will help them. We know that Black folks experience, because of historical and ongoing structural racism in housing, landlord discrimination. So we need to be thoughtful about landlord engagement for our rapid rehousing clients of color, right? Like, all of those things will matter, and all of those things may be going on to a lesser or greater extent that are contributing to a disparate outcome in returns to homelessness for Black clients in rapid rehousing. That same kind of what might be going, I think of it as like this, what might be going on here, list out all the possibilities. And then for each of the what might be going on here's, what are some solutions to that? All of that has to happen to truly build a system that is equitably responsible for the people that we're serving.
Thank you, Mindy. We have a question from Beth that Abby, you've answered in the chat. I'm gonna follow up in writing to Beth to make sure that we have that. I just want to thank you, Mindy, for your work today. Abby as well. Thank you for Carrie for jumping in. I did want to say that I do have one community I'm working with, Tucson, Pima County, Arizona, who is part of a one of 10 communities nationally that is working with HUD technical assistance to look at racial equity and assessment tools and prioritization. I think when that work matriculates after those 10 communities are done, we're going to have more information. So I know it feels desperate. It feels like you're not getting what you need all the time right away, but we are working on a few things. So I wanted to leave us with that. Thank you for your participation today. Hopefully you enjoyed this. We are going to pick up and have more conversation about coordinator next week, which could include this topic as well. I know that giving this 45 minutes is not sufficient. We're just scratching the surface. So if you have questions, please reach out to us. We're happy to kind of continue to work with you. And Beth, please note that I will get you something in writing. And that concludes our session for today. We'll see you next week when we pick up more information on coordinated entry. Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.